Okay, so we are going to discuss the materials used in this scene in Blender. And the good news is that you can make this with just base Blender. No external add-ons needed. So we are here in the scene. As you can see, this thing has no shaders whatsoever. Before we begin shading this mesh, we first want to change the world influence on it. Because one of the most important things for me in an anime scene is the world light influencing the model. So we are just going to make a basic world material, duplicate the background node, bring in a light path and a mix shader, and put those together. So now one controls the light the world is emitting, and one controls how the world looks. So the first one, we are going to make it to a darkish blue because we want to make it a rainy day. So that's what I want to do. And as you can see, the mesh is getting nicely influenced here. It's getting blue already without any materials. And then we are going to move to how the world is viewed from outside. I'm just going to make a simple world shader, gradient, Ctrl-T the gradient, add a color ramp and play with the colors until we get a nice bluish sky. Before we texture the mesh, we're also going to light it up, because that is another thing that lends to the anime look of any environment, is how you light it up. So we are going to bring in first a sun, rotate it to however you want. I'm going to rotate it a bit on the Y and the X and the Z, and then I'm going to set the light to around 3 or 4, because then we can get some nice bright highlights on this mesh. We're not done yet, because we are going to add another area light to add some more highlights at the back of the mesh, so that it can get a more contrasty look and a bit more stylized. So I'm going to set that light to around 100 after positioning it behind the street light. And that is now our lighting. And as you can see, before we even started shading, it already has a specific look that we want. And now we move on to the shader. The shader is also super simple. We're just going to bring in a Musgrave texture and bring in a color ramp, and there's basically not much else to it. You just bring in a mix RGB, set that to multiply, and then we are just going to use the mix RGB to burn some dark bits onto the light material. And that is the base texture for this mesh. And after making the Musgrave base shader, just add a shader to RGB in front of the BSDF so that it has a nice stylized look. All we need to add are some light on the edges. So for the round edged meshes like the poles, we are just going to bring in a Fresnel node, plug that into a color ramp, and then we just play with the settings. And after making the Fresnel node setup, we are just going to bring in a mix RGB and plug in the base shader into that mix RGB and make this Fresnel the bottom output, because we are going to set this mix RGB to any mode that applies the light edges to the mesh. So you can use color dodge, overlay, add, lighten, whichever one you think is best. I use this one, and as you can see already, it has a nice light overlap on these round edges. And to finish it off, we are just going to add a noise texture into the factor and play around with it with the color ramp. So without any plugins, we have this nice light edges, and we can just copy and paste it throughout the meshes. So we use this one for the wires of the pole, and we are just going to use the same thing for the poles. As for the hard edge things, I use the ambient occlusion node. This one doesn't work very good, but it suffices for having light edges. You just bring in an ambient occlusion node, set that to inner, and we are going to bring this module to around 0.2 or 0.1, depending on you. And then we just put a color in front of it and play around with the settings. But that is pretty much it for the scene. As you can see, it's not very complicated, but once you use every single avenue in Blender to your advantage, boosts the scene and makes it look even more incredible. For the lights on this mesh, I just made it a simple emission. But that is it for today. Hope you learned something and hope you enjoyed. See you in the next one. Bye.